Every Christmas, the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire invite the children who live on their Derbyshire estate to a party in the Painted Hall at Chatsworth. The Duke has just returned from his solicitors.
I've been to Curry's, and all Curry's say to me is, well, really, by and large, not been too bad. Not really too bad. You've done certain things that are quite good for the estate. But the thing is, you've come to the end of your useful life.
So we've got to die, I know.
You're all right. No, she doesn't matter. I mean, she does matter. I've come to the end of my useful life.
Some people think that in the last 100 years or so, the British aristocracy as a whole has come to the end of its useful life.
Right, children, would you like to move upstairs, please?
Dukes are the most senior rank in the British peerage, and Devonshire is one of the great dukedoms. These children all live in the 3 or 4 villages which the Duke of Devonshire owns, and he is said to be particularly fond of this event, so no expense is spared to give the local children a good time.
I'm going to tickle you. Shall I tickle you, noisy?
Today, the Chatsworth estate has 165 staff. There are 12 departments dealing with everything from the rented properties and the art collection to the restaurant, the farm, and their Grace's personal staff, including seamstress, butler, and private secretary. Today, the Duke and his family still own one of the most extensive country estates in Britain. Chatsworth is one of the most visited stately homes, and it houses one of the largest private art collections in the country. Yet despite all this, Andrew Cavendish, the 11th Duke of Devonshire, believes that the British aristocracy no longer enjoys real wealth or influence.
Well, no longer a force, largely because of tax. I mean, few aristocratic families have got money, and you can't have, I mean, why should you have obligations if all your money's been taken away? But they are, I mean, you can say about the aristocracy in 2 words: they're a spent force.
And what is the purpose of the aristocracy, or can you define an aristocrat for me?
It was to look after those who lived on the land. They were great landowners. It was their job to see that their tenants were properly provided and looked after.
Georgina Silcott.
The landlord has got a responsibility to be a good one and meet his tenants' demands. But I repeat the words, they're a spent force, and people should realise that.
Is the Duke of Devonshire right? Is the story of the British aristocracy's last 100 years one of terminal decline, or survival against the odds?
We must say a great big thank you to their Graces the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire for inviting us, for making it such a wonderful occasion. So we're going to do 3 cheers for the Duke and Duchess. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Hip, hip. Hip, hip. And best of all, hip, hip.
To examine the Duke of Devonshire's claim, we've been to country houses across Britain and Ireland to ask aristocrats to tell us about their family's experience since the last quarter of the 19th century. Then, the owners of the great country estates were still confident in their view of themselves as the ruling class. In 1893, the members of the House of Lords had themselves painted at work in the Palace of Westminster. The 2 paintings, which still hang just off the Peers' lobby, show the government and opposition benches in the House of Lords, an image of the late 19th century peerage, a class on the brink of losing its power. There were about 560 peers sitting then. They were divided into 5 ranks, with 27 dukes at the top, followed by marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons. The basis of their power was land. Altogether, the aristocracy owned about 4/5 of the entire country. Among the top landowners were the Dukes of Westminster, Buccleuch, Bedford and Northumberland. These major grandees each owned houses and estates in several counties. One of the wealthiest of all was the Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth. His 200,000 acres were spread across 14 different counties. Chatsworth in Derbyshire, the so-called Palace of the Peaks, was one of 7 great houses he owned.
There's a fascinating house at Bolton Abbey where they used to go in August, and Hardwicke Hall near here, which is the most staggering Elizabethan house you've ever seen in your life. It's where they used to go in October. And then they had a house called Compton Place at Eastbourne, which is also beautiful in a different sort of way, where they went in the summer, earlier summer. And then they went to Lismore Castle in Ireland in January, February and March. So they were forever packing, but of course their journeys were ruled by the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
The 8th Duke had to wait until he was 58 to succeed to the dukedom, so for most of his long political career he sat in the House of Commons and was known as Lord Hartington, or Hearty-Tarty for short. A classic aristocrat, he was as keen on fishing and horse racing as he was on politics. Hartington was the last of the great Whig politicians, a liberal aristocrat who supported gradual reform and was believed to be above self-interest.
I think he was typical, very typical, in that he had, in spite of whatever his peculiar his private life, he had a great sense of public duty. I mean, I think he really was entirely motivated in his political career by a sense of duty. I don't think he was ambitious.
Isn't he wonderful? Can't you see? When he was asked in the cabinet, should we do this or that, he used to have long silence, and he used to say, far better not. I should think that people could learn from him now, don't you think?
Hartington actually refused Queen Victoria's offer to be Prime Minister on 3 occasions. But he was a minister in numerous governments, and a rival of Gladstone and Chamberlain as the leading Liberal politician of the day. The other great aristocratic politician was the Marquis of Salisbury, who was Tory Prime Minister for 14 years. He shared the concern of many peers that the growth of democracy was undermining the power of the landed classes. In 1884, a bill to give more people the vote was vetoed by the Lords. There were widespread public protests, including a massive gathering at Hyde Park. Amid calls for the abolition of hereditary peers, the bill was passed. The members of the House of Lords still believed that they were born to rule, and so did their wives. This was the era of the political hostess, women who used London society to support their husbands' careers. The love of Lord Hartington's life was Louise von Alten, the daughter of a German aristocrat. But when they first met, she was already married to the Duke of Manchester. So Louise and Hartington had to continue a clandestine affair for 30 years.
I think it was an open secret. The world of Westminster and Mayfair knew all about it. I dare say the wider world didn't know. Of course, there wasn't private eye, nor were there the tabloids.
When they finally married and took up residence at Chatsworth, the Double Duchess, as she was then known, ushered in a new era at the house. The great dining room became the scene for some spectacular entertaining.
When she came here, she was already quite old, about 60, I suppose. She made a tremendous effect on the place because she brought people and they entertained a lot, and they gave a tremendous children's party for the estate children every Christmas. All the things that hadn't happened for years and years and years. So they really brought the house back to life. She was very keen on racing. She was a great gambler and all those things. I suppose it was a sort of smart set of the time, especially as they were friends with the Prince of Wales and the future Queen Alexandra, so they used to come.
The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, was the acknowledged leader of aristocratic society. He moved from country house to country house, mixing the old money with the new. The old aristocracy attached great importance to the social hierarchy. Some devoted their lives to improving their social position. One such was Christopher Sykes, the younger son of a Yorkshire baronet. The Sykes family estate at Sledmere consisted of 34,000 acres in East Yorkshire. After the peerage, baronets form the next layer in the aristocratic pyramid. They have hereditary titles but no seat in the House of Lords. Christopher Sykes divided his time between the house in Yorkshire and London.
He was obviously, an intellectual. That was one side of his life. But the other side was he would go to London and leave what he considered to be a totally idle, useless life, going round from party to party, trying to sort of ingratiate himself into a higher society.
Because younger sons didn't inherit, their marriage prospects weren't good. Many went into the church or the army. Sykes became MP for Beverley, but during 27 years in the Commons he only ever got one bill passed. It was about the preservation of seabirds and earned him the nickname the Gull's Friend. However, during those years he had made progress socially, and was now mixing with the likes of Hartington and the Prince of Wales.
That's right, there's one.
The present Christopher Sykes, also a younger son of the family, is fascinated by his great-great-uncle's story.
Now, these relate to the time when he became a very close friend and confidant of the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, who he met in the 1860s. And they became very, very firm friends. This would be a Goodwood racing party. And wherever the Prince went, Christopher was always there, you see. That is a shooting party at Wynyard. The Prince of Wales is there wearing a Homburg hat, with Christopher right in the middle again. Another house party at Sandringham with a lot of foreign royalty. Prince Edward of Saxe-Weimar, the King of Portugal, Prince Nicholas of Greece, Prince John of Glucksburg, wherever that was. Don't know what's become of him.
And on the end of the royal lineup, the now ever-present Christopher Sykes.
I mean, this must have been his finest hour, really, because the Prince of Wales was the leader of society, and Christopher Sykes was his closest confidant. So if his aim was to be at the top of the social ladder in London, he'd reached it now. But it soured in some house party when all the gentlemen were sitting round after dinner. And the Prince of Wales suddenly took it upon himself to pick up his glass of brandy that he was drinking and tip it over Uncle Christopher's head. When the brandy landed on his hair and trickled down his face to the golden beard, Christopher showed a rare thing, an excess of presence of mind. Not a muscle moved. Then, after a pause, he inclined to the Prince and said, without any discernible trace of arrogance or amusement, "As your Royal Highness pleases." The effect of this is recorded as being quite indescribably funny. The whole room burst into violent paroxysms of laughter, and no one laughed more heartily, and certainly not more loudly than the Prince. Laughter begat laughter. The jest was prolonged till the very act of mirth was unbearable. Christopher dripped. Without a smile on his face, he made no effort to mop up the tiny rivulets of spirit. The brandy had been poured by a royal hand. It was sacred. And I'm afraid, having done that, things just went from worse to worse. It wasn't a glass of brandy, and it was a whole decanter that would go over his head. They used to push him under a billiard table after dinner and sort of hunt him with billiard cues.
As well as being humiliated by the royal set, Sykes was left virtually bankrupt by his efforts to entertain the Prince. In that respect, he was not alone. The extravagant demands of high society left many aristocrats deep in debt. In the 1870s, the owners of the great landed estates faced a new threat to their fortunes, a prolonged agricultural depression. The Wolseley estate in Staffordshire is one of the oldest in England. Some of the land here was held by a Wolseley in King Alfred's day. 1,000 years and several Wolseley halls later, and the family is still here. It is now the home of the 11th Baronet. Sir Charles Wolseley has not only inherited a title and a remarkable lineage, but also the long-standing family tradition of being seriously hard up.
Indeed, the family had been short of money since the 5th Baronet. The 6th was a big gambler and high liver. The 7th spent it all on his radical endeavours. The 8th didn't do very much, didn't live very long. The 9th inherited the land, but no money.
The 9th Baronet was the archetypal Victorian gentleman. A brilliant horseman, he played in the first ever polo championship in this country. Sir Charles served in the Staffordshire Yeomanry. The present Sir Charles, his great-grandson, was in the same regiment. It's just one of many curious parallels between the lives of the two Sir Charleses.
He inherited about the same age as I did. He inherited debts rather than capital. Apart from the land, I did the same for estate duty. And we set about resolving it in different ways, neither more successful than the other, it seems, thus far anyway.
The agricultural depression forced the 9th Baronet to sell off property and land from the family estate. As agricultural incomes fell, many landlords like Sir Charles had to reduce the rents they were demanding from their tenant farmers. The garden park business which the present Sir Charles started was a victim of the 1980s recession, and today the entire Wolseley estate, in the family for over 1,000 years, is on the market. And the parallels between the two Sir Charleses go on. Sir Charles the 9th Baronet married an American, Anna Murphy of San Francisco. And it was the story of that marriage which brought the present Sir Charles together with his American wife, Jeannie Brown.
I was researching a book on American heiresses who married into the British aristocracy between 1880 and 1905. And came across Sir Charles Wolseley, who married Anna Teresa Murphy in 1883. So I wrote to the Wolseley of the day. That's how it all began.
Jeannie Brown didn't just gain access to the Wolseley papers. She fell in love with Sir Charles and then married him to become the second American Lady Wolseley. The family letters she is still studying confirm the 9th Baronet's motive for marrying the American Anna Murphy.
He was just chronically short of money. He would never have remotely considered getting a job. Gentlemen sort of didn't do that. And so one of the few options left to him, other than selling off the estate, was finding someone to marry who had a little bit of money. And she had more than a little. She had quite a lot. It was all tied up legally. Of course, contracts were made, and it was about $2 million that she was going to bring in. And she, therefore, really had a great deal of control.
Anna and Charles had two sons, Edric and William, but Anna quickly tired of English country life.
She was quite bored and rather isolated here. I mean, I find it a little isolated now, and I can imagine what it would have been like 100 years ago.
She wanted to brighten the hall up, have bright colours, curtains, furniture. He wanted it all Victorian, dark brown and dingy and dark and overcrowded. These sort of differences in their views are evident in the correspondence.
You have driven me from Wolseley, from looking on Wolseley as a home, underlined, by your perpetual criticizing my tastes and all I wanted to do to the gloomy place. Whenever I propose to make anything bright and cheery, just tell me what attraction you have ever made of the place for me that I should ever want to return there. 3 exclamation marks.
He insisted on his way. She'd been brought up the daughter of a wealthy millionaire American in California, and was also, I think, spoiled and willful, and insisted on her way, and the two ways weren't the same.
A postcard made from one of their early engagement photographs, open post, so the postman and anyone can read it. For their wedding anniversary, she writes, "Almost driven to utter despair by ill treatment and neglect by her Roman Catholic husband, and finally turned out of her home and deserted. Certainly, I found a great deal of unhappiness in the heiresses that I was researching. The money they brought in was awfully important. I believe I'm correct in saying that indoor plumbing and all that sort of thing was improved at Blenheim by Consuelo Vanderbilt. And there again, if you look at that marriage, she was utterly miserable.
When the British aristocracy was hard up, it always married money. For over 100 titled families, the American heiress was a welcome source of cash.
Over $800 million came out of America in dowries. At least that was the estimated figure. A lot of people didn't announce to the world how much money they were bringing. But if Anna was bringing $2 million and she was not in the range of fabulously wealthy, a lot of money changed hands.
But Anna's dollars had not solved the cash flow problems at Wolseley Hall. As well as selling the contents of his house, Sir Charles, like many other aristocrats, was forced to dispose of yet more land. Just as land was no longer always profitable, so it became the source of increasing political trouble for the British aristocracy. Nowhere was the land question more acute than in Ireland, where many English aristocrats owned big estates. The Duke of Devonshire's Irish home, Lismore Castle, was in County Waterford. He and his fellow Irish landowners were now the targets of rural unrest. When Viscount Montmorris was murdered in 1880 during the so-called Land War, all Irish landowners felt threatened. Sir Jocelyn Gore Booth, owner of Lissadell in County Sligo.
Well, at last I succeeded in opening the front door. This is where the carriages used to arrive. I've always been intrigued by the way in which this porch was built. And if you look up at the windows, which after all are, 8 feet above ground level at the bottom, they still have these substantial iron bars. I would imagine put there to make sure that if there wasn't a difficulty locally, it wasn't that easy to get into the house. And the doors themselves, which, as you can see, are considerable height, I have no idea what it is, 20 feet, that sort of thing, they would have been closed at night, both sides. And these massive bolts would have been dropped to make sure they didn't blow open. And then in addition to the bolts, and I'm not going to try this, I'm afraid, because they no longer work, these vast wooden pins would have been lifted across the doors to secure them there. So there really was no question of getting in once the doors were shut and barred. And I suppose, just in case somebody got this far who wasn't regarded as a desirable guest or whatever, there was a little spy hole there, and I imagine a porter or somebody was sitting in the cubicle behind it, and he would look out and, if necessary, open the little window and ask what your business was.
Lissadell is one of the most romantic of Irish country houses. It was the childhood home of the nationalist heroine Constance Gore Booth, and Yeats was a regular houseguest. During the Land War, the butler at Lissadell was Thomas Kilgallen. In his memoirs, he detailed the precautions the family took against attack.
There were rumours of the Fenians rising at this time. There were great preparations in the house for their reception. Iron plates were fitted on lower bedroom shutters, and here they are to this day. Old guns and rifles carefully examined and loaded. Hand grenades, pistols, and swords seen to. The bullet moulds taken out, and bullets made for each of the different rifles. Extra powder and shot ordered. All the rifles and guns were muzzle loaders. I was kept busy making bullets in the gun room. Nothing came of it.
There were about 1,000 tenants on the Lissadell estate. The average holding was a mere 30 acres. The famine had hit Sligo particularly hard, and although Sir Robert Gore Booth was not among the toughest of Irish landlords, many of his tenants still lived in desperate poverty.
He had an unpopular agent at one point, but as I'm always saying to my own agent, it's part of the job of being the agent to be the Mr. Nasty, if you like. I think he was always on good terms with people who lived here, but being a powerful man and liking to have his own way, he obviously had some enemies.
During the land war, any big house was a likely target. At Lissadell, they received one of the so-called Captain Moonlight letters, which were sent as a threat to many Irish landlords.
My dear Lucifer, I must inform you that you have the poorest tenants in Ireland, and all owing to your bad treatment. But do you see, bad? The time has come that, by God, we don't care for man or the devil, is that you are stuck in Lissadell like the devil in hell. But I'll meet you like Parson Bell. On the reverse side of the sheet of paper was a sketch of a coffin, marked died 1882, and the words Captain Moonlight printed in large letters. That must have sent a shiver down his spine, I suppose.
The biggest shock for the British establishment came with the Phoenix Park murders in 1882. Frederick Cavendish, Lord Hartington's younger brother, was set upon and killed a few hours after he arrived in Dublin to be the new Chief Secretary. Ireland now dominated British politics. The painting in the Lords actually depicts the famous Home Rule debate in 1893. It was in this debate that the Liberal peers, led by Lord Hartington, joined forces with the Tories under their leader, Lord Salisbury, and defeated Home Rule.
He was wrong over Home Rule. He was wrong for perfectly good reason, which was that he thought that Ireland, separate from the United Kingdom, would suffer materially, and I think that's probably true to say that it has done. I mean, but man doesn't live by bread alone, and he didn't see the strength of nationalism.
Irish landowners were saved from Home Rule, but over the next 10 years a series of new laws encouraged them to sell land to their tenants. At Lissadell, the Gore Booths eventually reduced their estate from 30,000 to 3,000 acres. Sir Henry Gore Booth, son of Sir Robert, devoted less time than his father to public affairs and estate management, and concentrated instead on his own private obsession, travel and exploration. With his butler Kilgallen as steward, Sir Henry made a series of Arctic voyages, hunting whales and bears as he went.
I think it might be interesting to describe the incident of the bear, because obviously in the Arctic you come across bears quite often, and on one occasion my great-grandfather, who was quite a keen shot, got a bear in his sights, pulled the trigger of his rifle, and the trigger didn't do what it should. The rifle just clicked, and the bear was obviously fairly close. And the story is that Kilgallen, faithful to the last, got hold of another rifle, shot the thing between the eyes. Anyway, here is the bear, which was brought back to Lissadell and stuffed. It's been given some cosmetic treatment recently. The feet had fallen off when it was used by my father and his brothers and sisters to negotiate their bicycles around the hall. But there is the bear, and we're proud to have him.
Travel to exotic locations was fashionable among Victorian aristocrats. Egypt was a popular destination. Christopher Sykes went there, as did the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. Others went to Africa and India. It seemed that many aristocrats were choosing to escape the increasingly competitive business of public life for the thrills of travel and exploration. Sir Henry Gore Booth's greatest Arctic adventure was a rescue mission.
He had a great friend called Lee Smith, who'd gone off to the Arctic in a separate vessel called the Era in, I think, 1881. And Sir Henry had said jovially, while walking down Regent Street or whatever, "Oh, if you aren't back by such and such a date, I'll come and rescue you." And of course he didn't return by such and such a date, so Sir Henry felt in honour bound to go and rescue him. So he got hold of this boat, and off he went. And eventually he met up with Lee Smith, whose boat was completely fast in the ice, and brought him home. And in gratitude, Lee Smith gave Sir Henry his boot, which survives to this day, rather like the bear over there, the boot worn by Mr. Lee Smith in Franz Joseph Land, where he went in 1881 and 1882, owing to the loss of his yacht Ara, with nearly all his provisions. They lived principally on walruses and bears. Must have been an anxious winter, don't you think?
And aristocrats didn't just travel for fun. There was an empire to rule too. The Marquis of Aberdeen spent 5 years in Canada as Governor-General, and then a further 10 as Viceroy of Ireland. With his wife Ishbel as Vicereine, they were expected to preside at Dublin Castle in grand style and at their own expense. Earl Beauchamp was Governor-General of New South Wales at the tender age of 27, and Lord Curzon was one of a number of peers who enjoyed the most sought-after imperial position of all, Viceroy of India. But at home, landowners faced another new threat to their estates: death duties. At Chatsworth, the Duke of Devonshire claimed the modest 8% tax would make it impossible for him to keep up Chatsworth. The Duke of Richmond and 50 other peers signed a petition complaining about the disastrous effects of the new tax. In 1897, Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. Despite their anxieties about death duties and agricultural depression, the aristocracy still ruled the social world, and the celebrations gave them a chance to prove it. By now, the Duchess of Devonshire was a dominant figure in smart society, and she decided she would throw the biggest party of all for the Jubilee season. The Duke's London residence was Devonshire House, a vast mansion just off Piccadilly. The Duchess announced that there would be a grand ball there in July. She asked her guests to come as allegorical or historical figures from before 1815. She would be a Syrian queen, Zenobia of Palmyra.
You can't see that she was beautiful, I don't think, in either of these, but it's very hard. I don't know how old she was to that, but it's hard with other fashions. Look at the hair, how strange.
The present Duchess still keeps the original costume in her wardrobe.
But that little short neck is so unattractive, isn't it? Don't you think? This is her dress that she wore, and here she is in it. Looking a right fright, really, doesn't she? The work on it is wonderful, isn't it? And the weight of it. And, I mean, it's all proper heavy stuff. It's not real jewels, but it's the next best thing. I believe some of them did have real jewels on their clothes, sewn onto their clothes. It does seem incredible, doesn't it? But they really went to town over the dressing up.
The Duke came as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, with a costume based on a portrait by Titian.
He must have been absolutely fed up with it, because it's the sort of thing he really hated, I think. He was not interested in social life at all. He was a politician by nature, statesman, really. I think he thought it was the most frightful waste of time, but he adored his wife. He'd have done anything to please her.
In the garden at Devonshire House, the society photographers set up a studio in a tent to record the guests in their costumes. The resulting album gives a vision of one of the most extravagant aristocratic parties ever.
Oh dear, they are funny, aren't they? Countess of Minto. Well, she didn't look too bad. Beautiful dress, don't you think? Strange witch's hat. But this one, do look at that one. Do look at the photographer's furniture, how funny it is. Lady Doreen Long as Urania, goddess of astronomy. Princess of Wales, Prince of Wales, Duke and Duchess of York, Duchess of Fife, Duke of Fife, Princess Charles of Denmark, Duchess of Connaught. I do see they all came.
The Prince of Wales was guest of honour. He came as the Grand Prior of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, sporting a diamond Maltese cross. And new money was well represented in the shape of some of the Prince's smarter friends. Ernest Cassel, dressed as the painter Velasquez, was actually a financier and an advisor to the Prince. And Alfred Beit, who had made a fortune in the diamond mines of South Africa, was there as Prince Frederick of Nassau. The American wives were there in force. The daughter of the founder of the Marshall Field department store was now the Honourable Mrs. George Curzon, future Viceroy of India. Mrs. Paget, formerly Minnie Stevens of Boston, was there as Cleopatra in a $6,000 costume ablaze with precious gems. The New York press reported that when she entered, people accustomed to the greatest displays of jewellery in the world gasped with wonder and astonishment. And Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, appeared in the tightly laced costume of a 17th century French diplomat's wife. This despite being 7 months pregnant. Whether the photograph was touched up or not, history does not relate. Faced with the style of these American women, the old English aristocrats were not to be outdone.
The Marchioness of Londonderry, who had an immense social position then, came as the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria in the most wonderful white satin dress with gold embroidery all down the front, and the famous Londonderry jewels. An awful lot of them were draped over her imposing décolletage, and others of her jewels had been reset into the most marvellous and realistic crown. She looked absolutely wonderful.
Costume balls were all the rage then, and some guests went to elaborate lengths to be original, especially in their headgear. Mrs. Asquith appeared as an oriental snake charmer, complete with a papier-mâché snake on her head. The celebrated New York singer Mrs. Ronalds, there as Euterpe, the spirit of music, with notes from Verdi embroidered on her dress, had a diamond lyre in her crown which lit up by means of a tiny battery hidden in her hair. Mrs. Talbot's winged Valkyrie helmet gave her a terrible headache, but that was nothing compared to the trouble the Countess of Westmoreland had. As Hebe, goddess of youth, she chose to attach a stuffed eagle to her shoulders. And the hostess herself made a suitably dramatic entrance. She appeared at the head of an oriental procession.
The Duchess of Devonshire came as the Queen of Egypt, borne in on a litter, escorted by these glamorous society women, got up as oriental slaves with gauze trousers and waving ostrich feather fans.
I think most of the people who went were fairly old, because all their contemporaries, you see, were in their 60s. And it seems so funny to give a ball to a lot of very old people. There were some young ones, no doubt, but when you look through the book, they mostly look that sort of thing, that sort of age. That's terrific. Duchess of Devonshire's ball.
In 1901, the British aristocracy gathered in the capital for Queen Victoria's funeral. And a year later, the aristocracy lost its staunchest defender when Lord Salisbury retired, ending his long reign as leader of the Tories. In the new Edwardian era, aristocratic society came increasingly under the public gaze. This was the heyday of Ascot, and aristocratic and royal patronage took horse racing to the peak of its popularity. The public came in huge numbers to watch both the racing and the aristocratic owners. Lord Lonsdale spent so much on carriages and horses he was forced to sell 4 family houses. And such stories of extravagance were not confined to the world of racing. Plas Newydd in Anglesey provided one of the most bizarre. The first Marquis of Anglesey, one of the nation's great military heroes, led the cavalry charge at Waterloo. The lesser-known 5th Marquis was not a military man.
The 5th Marquis, of course, was an oddity. He died, incidentally, before he was 30. He may have been illegitimate. We're not at all certain about that. But he was a very odd fellow, and he was extremely well off because the family was in those days. There was an enormous amount of property and so on. And he spent a very, very large amount of money on clothes, which he loved. I think he had 400 pairs of pyjamas and 300 waistcoats and that sort of thing, most of which were never worn. And he bought all sorts of things funny. But he was mad keen about the theatre. And he started here in what had been the big chapel, which doesn't exist anymore, a full theatre. And he used to pay the famous actors and actresses from London to come and play second to him.
Whatever the show, the Marquis himself took the lead. He frequently adapted the script to include his party piece, a solo number called the Butterfly Dance. There is no surviving account of quite what the Butterfly Dance was.
And there's Red Riding Hood. And of course, at the bottom, in scene 4, the Marquis of Anglesey will introduce his Snow Dance. I wonder what that was like. And then there were other things like this, Miss Brown's Trouble, the Marquis of Anglesey's company, a screamingly funny farcical comedy, produced under the personal direction of Mr. Alex Keith, who was one of the great people in the theatre at that time.
One of his favourite roles was Queen Eleanor, a part which demanded a particularly voluptuous outfit. As the performances and costumes became more and more elaborate, the dancing Marquis spent more and more money. He even took his shows on tour abroad, giving audiences in Berlin and Dresden the chance to enjoy the famous Butterfly Dance. Naturally, the Marquis chose a woman of real beauty to be his wife.
The woman who the 5th Marquis married was my grandmother, Lily, who is the beautiful lady in this rather unusual pastel portrait. She was strikingly beautiful, with this wonderful, wonderful Titian red hair and very, very pale skin. While they were on honeymoon in Paris, she stopped to admire the window display of the famous jeweller shop called Van Cleef & Arpels. And the highly extravagant 5th Marquis immediately walked into the shop and bought the entire window display, which would have been lovely for her had he not forced her to sleep wearing all the jewellery. It turned out that he had a complete fetish about jewels. The closest the marriage ever came to consummation was that he would make her pose naked, just covered from top to bottom in jewels, and she had to sleep wearing the jewellery. The marriage only lasted 6 weeks, and she came, running home. I think she had a pretty miserable time, really.
His theatrical exploits eventually led the Marquis into serious debt. He owed more than £250,000 to various jewellers alone, and in 1904 trustees took over his property to pay off the creditors.
When the great Anglesey sales came, which lasted 47 days, the jewellery only made £30,000 or something. It was expected to make £300,000, so that was false. But there were hundreds of other things. Clothing on a scale that was unbelievable. He couldn't have worn half of what he bought, or anything like half.
Press reports of the Anglesey sales detailed with some relish the items on offer and the prices that were paid.
Lord Anglesey's coronation robe in crimson velvet with coronet was sold yesterday at Anglesey Castle for £59. An open-work paste dog collar, £5, 10 shillings. A flexible ditto, £6, and a flexible ditto. And 2 others, £5, 10 and £5.50 respectively, etc., etc.
In the end, he lost a lot, yes. Yeah. Just from complete extravagance. He's quite a character, wasn't he? The dancing Marquis, I love it.
Such stories only confirmed the growing public view of the aristocracy as profligate and indulgent. In 1906, when Asquith and the Liberals won a landslide victory at the polls, the landowners feared an attack on their interests. It was Lloyd George's 1909 budget which provoked the inevitable showdown. He proposed some modest land taxes to raise money for pensions and the Navy. When the Lords rejected the budget, Lloyd George attacked them without mercy.
In a particularly telling phrase, he described the House of Lords
as 500 ordinary men chosen accidentally from the unemployed. Now, since the unemployed were regarded by many at the time as being the victims not of circumstance or of the social system, but of their own fecklessness, to describe the House of Lords, this august body, as being a lot of layabouts, as the unemployed were regarded by many as being, this was a most savage attack, and this was deeply resented.
The Lords' rejection of Lloyd George's budget led to a 2-year constitutional battle over the powers of the upper house. In a series of bravura speeches, the Chancellor offered a powerful critique of the whole system of land ownership.
He said, by what right are 10,000 people owners of the soil in this country, and the rest of us trespassers in the land of our birth? This was powerful stuff.
In the so-called Peers versus the People election of 1910, posters went up all over the country ridiculing their lordships. The dukes were depicted as bloated, money-grabbing fools dressed in their coronets and ermine. After 2 election victories, Lloyd George prevailed over the Lords and his budget was passed. The resulting Parliament Act did not in fact diminish the power of the upper house much at all, but the aristocracy had suffered an irreversible blow. Its claim to be the governing class was at an end. As the military class, the aristocracy soon had another opportunity to lead the nation from the front. But the Great War dealt another serious blow to aristocratic survival. Losses were disproportionately high among the officers. As a consequence, the aristocracy were to advance into the 1920s and 30s with their ranks drastically depleted.